When a tech billionaire watched his autistic son have a meltdown in front of 47 investors, he never imagined that the janitor who calmed his child would turn out to be the MIT genius he'd rejected without an interview, orchestrating the most brilliant revenge in corporate history. This isn't just a story about a father learning to listen to his son. This is about how a 12-year-old coding prodigy and an undocumented scientist brought down an empire of ignorance and rebuilt it into something beautiful. What happens when the people you underestimate turn out to be the ones who can save everything you thought mattered? If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or misunderstood, this story will hit you like lightning. Hit that like button if you're ready to see how genius hides in the most unexpected places. Drop a comment about a time someone surprised you with their hidden talents. And subscribe because what you're about to witness will completely change how you see intelligence, autism, and the price of judging people by their job titles instead of their brilliance. Trust me, you need to watch this until the very end. The silence that followed 12-year-old Marcus Chen Rodriguez's screams was so deafening that even the hum of Phoenix's most advanced tech building seemed to hold its breath. In the gleaming conference room of Meridian Innovations, where million-dollar deals were made daily, something far more valuable was breaking apart. David Chen, CEO and tech billionaire, watched his autistic son melt down in front of 47 investors, who had flown in from across the country to witness what David had promised would be a revolutionary presentation about AI communication technology for nonverbal children. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a man claiming he could help thousands of children communicate, yet he stood frozen and helpless as his own son thrashed on the marble floor, completely overwhelmed by the conference room's harsh LED lights and the cacophony of confused voices. Marcus had been doing so well that morning. He'd even managed to say, "Good luck, Dad," before David left for the office, a rare verbal moment that had filled David with hope. But now, watching his son's small body convulse with panic, David felt that familiar, crushing weight of failure. Every specialist, every therapy session, every expensive intervention had led to this moment of public humiliation. The investors shifted uncomfortably in their Italian leather chairs, some checking their phones, others exchanging glances that said everything David feared they were thinking. This was supposed to be his company's defining moment, the presentation that would secure $100 million in funding and establish Meridian Innovations as the leader in assistive technology. Instead, it was becoming his personal nightmare broadcast in real time. "Sir, perhaps we should reschedule," whispered Janet, his assistant, reaching toward Marcus with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd handled this crisis before. But her approach only made Marcus scream louder, his hands clawing at the air as if fighting invisible demons. That's when something extraordinary happened. From the corner of the room, where she'd been quietly emptying trash bins and dusting surfaces, a young Latina woman in a gray janitor's uniform moved with the fluid grace of someone who understood crisis without panic. Sofia Morales didn't ask permission or announce her intentions. She simply knelt beside Marcus, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out a well-worn tablet from her cleaning cart. The soft melody that emerged from the device cut through the chaos like a whispered secret. Sofia began tracing gentle patterns on her phone screen, her finger creating flowing shapes that seemed to hypnotize not just Marcus, but everyone watching. Within 30 seconds, Marcus's screams softened to whimpers. Within a minute, he was sitting up, his dark eyes fixed on Sofia's finger movements with an intensity that bordered on wonder. The room full of investors, CEOs, and tech executives watched in stunned silence as this woman, whom they'd barely noticed moments before, accomplished what teams of specialists had failed to do for months. David felt something crack inside his chest as he watched his son's face transform from tortured confusion to focused calm. Marcus began mimicking Sofia's finger patterns, his small hands creating mirror images on an invisible screen in the air. For the first time in 6 months, Marcus looked genuinely peaceful in a public space. But David's relief was overshadowed by a more complicated emotion, one that tasted like shame mixed with desperate gratitude. Here, in front of the people who would determine his company's future, a janitor had just demonstrated something that made his entire presentation look like expensive theater. The tension in the room shifted like a tide changing direction. Some investors leaned forward with renewed interest, while others began gathering their papers with the efficient movements of people who'd already made their decision. But what happened next would shatter everything David Chen thought he knew about power, pride, and his own son. The moment Sofia helped Marcus find his calm, David's carefully constructed world began to crumble with the efficiency of a controlled demolition. By 8 a.m. the following morning, Meridian Innovations stock had plummeted 12% in after-hours trading. The tech blogs were already calling it the Meltdown presentation, and David's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from investors pulling their commitments. The irony was brutal and inescapable. A man who'd built his fortune on communication technology had just watched his empire crack because he couldn't communicate with his own child. David sat in his corner office, staring at the Phoenix skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that usually made him feel like he ruled the world. Now they felt like the walls of a very expensive prison. His assistant Janet knocked and entered without waiting for permission, her face carrying the grim expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The Chen Industries Board wants an emergency meeting," she announced. "And sir, there's a woman here to see you. The janitor from yesterday. Security tried to turn her away, but she says you called her." David hadn't called anyone. He'd been too busy fielding calls from furious investors and watching his life's work dissolve in real time. But something about Sofia Morales had haunted him through the sleepless night. The way she'd moved with such quiet confidence, the way Marcus had responded to her like she held some secret key that everyone else had been searching for. When Sofia entered his office, she looked different somehow. Gone was the deferential posture of a service worker navigating wealthy spaces. She walked with the measured confidence of someone who belonged exactly where they were. "Mr. Chen," she said, her slight accent carrying a formality that felt almost mocking. "I believe we need to talk." David's anger, simmering since dawn, finally found its target. "Talk? You think we need to talk? Do you have any idea what you've done? My son had an episode in front of 47 investors, and you just inserted yourself into a private family matter without permission. You made us look like we can't handle our own child." Sofia listened to his outburst with the patience of someone who'd heard variations of this speech before. When he finished, she pulled out her worn tablet and placed it on his mahogany desk like she was laying down a royal flush. "Your son created this last night," she said simply. The screen displayed a complex sequence of visual patterns, flowing geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. David recognized the underlying structure immediately. It was code. Not just any code, but an elegant solution to the very problem his development team had been struggling with for 8 months. The algorithm that would make his AI communication platform actually work for nonverbal autistic children. His son, his supposedly limited son, had created in one evening what 23 MIT graduates couldn't solve in nearly a year. Where did he get this? David's voice cracked like ice under pressure. Sofia's smile was gentle but devastating. "He didn't get it anywhere, Mr. Chen. He made it. Marcus has been visiting my cleaning cart every night for months when you work late. I've been teaching him visual coding through pattern games. Your son isn't nonverbal because he can't communicate. He's nonverbal because no one's been speaking his language." The words hit David like physical blows. Every expensive therapy session, every specialist consultation, every moment he'd felt like a failure as a father suddenly reorganized itself into a different, more painful truth. He hadn't been trying to help Marcus communicate. He'd been trying to make Marcus communicate like everyone else. The difference was everything, and it had taken a janitor to show him what 20 years of parenting couldn't teach him. But as Sofia reached for her tablet to leave, David noticed something that made his blood freeze. The screen showed a timestamp. Marcus had created this masterpiece at 2:30 in the morning, long after David thought his son was safely asleep. What David discovered next would make him question everything he thought he knew about manipulation, trust, and the woman who had just turned his world upside down. The 2:30 a.m. timestamp on Marcus's code wasn't just a detail. It was a breadcrumb leading to a truth so calculated and shocking that it would redefine betrayal itself. Unable to sleep and desperate for answers, David found himself standing outside Sofia's apartment complex in South Phoenix at 10 o'clock that same night. The neighborhood was a world away from his Scottsdale mansion, where million-dollar homes sat behind gates like fortresses. Here, children played in small courtyards, while their parents worked multiple jobs just to survive. And David felt the uncomfortable weight of privilege pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. When Sofia opened her door, she didn't look surprised to see him. In fact, she looked like she'd been expecting this confrontation for months. "Come in, Mr. Chen," she said with the weary resignation of someone whose carefully constructed plan was finally unraveling. "It's time you saw who I really am." David stepped into her small apartment and immediately felt like he'd walked into a parallel universe. Every wall was covered with monitors displaying complex coding sequences, visual communication algorithms, and research papers from MIT, Stanford, and Harvard. This wasn't the home of a janitor struggling to pay rent. This was the laboratory of a brilliant mind operating in the shadows of a system that had refused to acknowledge her existence. Sofia watched David's face change as the pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. "My real name is Dr. Sofia Morales, Gutierrez," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years hiding her true identity. "I have a PhD in cognitive science from MIT and was a research fellow studying autism communication patterns until corporate restructuring destroyed my visa status 2 years ago. I've been working as a janitor not because I lack qualifications, but because I lack documentation." She moved to her largest monitor and pulled up a file that made David's blood run cold. It was his company's employee database, and there, highlighted in red, was a job application from 18 months ago. And Dr. Sofia Morales Gutierrez had applied for a senior research position at Meridian Innovations. The application had been rejected without an interview, with a notation that made David's stomach turn, "Does not fit company culture." But the revelation that would shatter David's understanding of everything wasn't about his company's hiring practices. Sofia pulled up security footage from Meridian Innovations, cameras David didn't even know existed in his own building. For 6 months, the footage showed Sofia leaving carefully designed visual puzzles and coding games in conference rooms, knowing that Marcus would find them during David's late-night work sessions. "I didn't save your son yesterday," Sofia said, her voice carrying the weight of months of calculated deception. "I've been teaching him to save himself for 6 months. Every meltdown, every breakthrough, every moment of progress has been part of a plan you were too blind to see." The laptop screen filled with logs showing Marcus accessing Sofia's private communication platform every single night for weeks, solving increasingly complex problems while his father slept, unaware that his supposedly limited son was becoming a coding prodigy under the guidance of a woman he'd dismissed as just the cleaning lady. David felt the ground shifting beneath him as Sofia delivered the final blow. "Marcus isn't just learning to communicate, David. He's learning to revolutionize how autistic children interface with technology. And he's already surpassed most of your employees." The room spun as David realized he'd been living in a carefully orchestrated illusion where the woman he tried to control had actually been controlling everything from the beginning. If this story of hidden genius and calculated justice is hitting you as hard as it's hitting David right now, let me know in the comments what you think Sofia's endgame really is. And if you're ready to see how a father's world completely crumbles when he discovers his son has been living a double life, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about intelligence, deception, and the price of underestimating someone based on their job title. But nothing could have prepared David for what he was about to witness when Sofia decided to prove that everything he believed about his son was a carefully constructed lie. The next evening, Sofia led David through the basement levels of his own building, areas he'd never bothered to explore in 15 years of ownership. Hidden beneath the gleaming corporate offices was a makeshift laboratory that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Monitors lined the walls, displaying cascading code and visual communication interfaces that pulsed with an almost organic rhythm. "Welcome to where the real innovation happens," Sofia said, her voice carrying the quiet pride of someone unveiling their life's work. "This is where your son has been coming every night for 6 months, learning to speak in the language his mind was designed for." David's hands trembled as he watched Sofia power up systems that were more advanced than anything in his company's official research and development department. The complexity was staggering, but what made his breath catch was the realization that this woman had built a technological marvel in the forgotten corners of his own building, right under his nose. When Marcus arrived, led by Sofia's text message, he moved through the basement laboratory with the confidence of someone who belonged there completely. Gone was the hesitant, overwhelmed child from the conference room. In his place stood a young man whose eyes sparkled with intellectual excitement as he approached the main terminal like a pianist sitting down at a concert grand. What happened next would forever change David's understanding of intelligence, autism, and the criminal waste of human potential. Marcus began creating code in real time, his fingers dancing across Sofia's visual interface with the fluid grace of a master artist. The algorithms he generated weren't just functional, they were elegant, solving in minutes problems that David's team of MIT graduates had been wrestling with for months. The boy who couldn't order food at a restaurant was building communication bridges that could help thousands of nonverbal children find their voices. David watched his son work with a mixture of awe and devastating recognition. This wasn't a child who needed to be fixed or managed or cured. This was a genius who'd been imprisoned by other people's limitations. The emotional earthquake that followed would crack the foundation of everything David thought he knew about fatherhood. Using Sofia's communication system, Marcus began typing messages that appeared on the screen with heartbreaking clarity. Dad always sad at work. Company losing money. Investors angry. I can fix the problems, but Dad never asks me. The words hit David like physical blows because they revealed a truth he'd been too proud and too blind to see. His son had been watching, understanding, and analyzing David's business struggles for months, while David treated him like a beautiful, broken thing to be protected rather than a brilliant mind to be engaged. The moment that would haunt David forever came when Marcus looked directly at him and typed, "I know Dad thinks I'm not smart because I can't talk like other kids. But I think in pictures and code and numbers, and when I try to use words, it's like trying to paint with a broken brush." Sofia gave me new brushes. The laboratory fell silent except for the gentle hum of computers and the sound of David's world completely reshaping itself around this new reality. But just as David began to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered, Sofia's phone buzzed with an emergency alert that would transform their private revelation into a public crisis. Outside the building, ICE enforcement vehicles were pulling into the parking lot, and someone had reported Sofia's immigration status to authorities. The basement sanctuary that had protected Sofia's work and Marcus's growth was about to become a trap. And David faced the most important decision of his life. Would he protect the woman who had deceived him but unlocked his son's potential? Or would he step aside and let the system that had rejected her brilliance finally claim its prize? What followed next would test everything David Chen believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of protecting the people you love. The ICE enforcement team moved with the cold efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times before, surrounding the building while David watched from the basement laboratory as his entire world balanced on the edge of a knife. Sofia's face had gone pale, but her hands remained steady as she began shutting down her systems with the methodical precision of someone who'd planned for this moment. "I need 10 minutes to encrypt everything," she whispered to David, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that her life's work was about to disappear forever. "Can you buy me 10 minutes? David's phone erupted with calls from his board members, investors, and legal team, all demanding to know why federal agents were searching his building and what connection he had to an undocumented worker. The corporate vultures could smell blood in the water, and they were circling with the hungry anticipation of predators who'd found wounded prey. Marcus stood frozen between his father and Sofia, his young mind processing the adult crisis unfolding around him with the sharp intelligence that David was only now beginning to recognize. When the boy began typing frantically on Sofia's tablet, David realized his son was trying to solve this problem the same way he solved everything else, through pure intellectual force and determination. The message that appeared on Marcus's screen would haunt David for the rest of his life. "If Sofia goes away, I go back to being broken. She taught me I'm not broken. She taught me I'm different smart. Dad, please don't let them take away my voice." The words cut through David's corporate conditioning like a sword through silk, exposing the raw truth that his son's breakthrough wasn't just about communication technology or business success. It was about a child's fundamental right to be understood and valued for who he was, not who others wanted him to become. At that moment, David Chen faced the defining choice of his life, and every dollar in his bank account, every connection in his network, every piece of power he'd accumulated over 2 decades suddenly had meaning only if he used it to protect the people who had shown him what real intelligence looked like. The phone call that would either save or destroy everything came at 11:47 that night. David's hands shook as he dialed the private number of Senator Patricia Williams, a woman whose presidential campaign he'd funded 3 years earlier with a 7-figure donation. "Patricia, I need a favor that's going to cost me everything," he said, his voice carrying the raw desperation of a father who'd finally learned what was worth fighting for. "I have a researcher in my building who's about to be deported, and she's the most brilliant mind I've ever encountered. If we lose her, we lose a breakthrough that could help thousands of autistic children, including my son. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, filled with the weight of political calculations and the cold mathematics of favor trading. When Senator Williams finally spoke, her words carried the brutal honesty of someone who understood exactly what David was asking. This will cost you everything, David. Your board will revolt, your investors will flee, and your enemies will use this against you forever. Are you absolutely certain this woman is worth destroying your empire? David looked at Marcus, who was still typing frantically on Sofia's tablet, trying to create a technological solution to a human problem, and he realized that his son had already answered that question. She's not worth destroying my empire, Patricia, David said, his voice growing stronger with each word. She's worth building a better one. The emergency board meeting that convened at 6 a.m. the next morning would become legendary in corporate circles, not for the business decisions made, but for the moment when one of America's most powerful CEOs chose to sacrifice everything he'd built for a principle that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. As David prepared to face his board members and explain why he was liquidating personal assets to fight a deportation case, Marcus sent him one final message that would give him the courage to walk into that boardroom and change everything. My dad is brave. But what happened in the 48 hours following David's act of corporate suicide would prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in America is underestimate the power of a father's love and a child's unbreakable spirit. The board meeting that was supposed to end David's career instead became the spark that ignited a revolution nobody saw coming. When David walked into that mahogany panel conference room and announced he was liquidating his personal assets to fight Sofia's deportation, the 12 board members reacted exactly as he'd expected. Shock, outrage, and immediate calls for his removal as CEO echoed off the walls like thunder in a corporate storm. But what David hadn't anticipated was Marcus, who had somehow convinced building security to let him into the meeting room just as the board was voting on his father's future. The 12-year-old boy, who had been dismissed as too damaged to contribute anything meaningful to society, walked to the front of the room and connected his tablet to the presentation system with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found his moment to speak. What appeared on the massive screen made every person in that room forget about stock prices, quarterly reports, and corporate governance protocols. Marcus had created a complete redesign of his father's AI communication platform, but this version was revolutionary in ways that none of the board members, despite their advanced degrees and decades of business experience, had ever imagined possible. The interface moved and breathed like a living thing, adapting in real time to each user's unique communication style, learning and evolving with every interaction. But the moment that would change everything wasn't the technical demonstration. It was when Marcus stepped to the microphone and spoke aloud for the first time in a corporate setting, his words clear and powerful despite the tremor of nervousness that made his voice shake slightly. My name is Marcus Chen Rodriguez, and I'm autistic. For 12 years, people have looked at me and seen what I can't do instead of what I can do. Sofia Morales didn't try to fix me because she understood I wasn't broken. She gave me tools to show the world what my mind can actually accomplish. The room fell silent as Marcus continued, his confidence growing with each word. My dad is trying to save Sofia because she saved me, but what you don't understand is that she's not just one person. She represents thousands of brilliant minds that America throws away because they don't fit into neat, comfortable categories. The board meeting that was supposed to destroy David's career was being live-streamed by Marcus himself, broadcast to autism advocacy groups, immigration rights organizations, and tech communities across the country through Sofia's secure network. Within hours, the hashtag #SaveSofia and Marcus was trending on every social media platform, and the story had captured the attention of millions of people who saw their own struggles reflected in this family's fight for dignity and recognition. The phone calls started immediately. Tech executives from Apple, Google, and Microsoft reached out, not to poach David's failing company, but to offer partnerships and funding for Sofia's communication platform. Autism advocacy organizations pledged millions in support, and immigration lawyers volunteered their services pro bono. The transformation was so swift and overwhelming that it felt like watching society itself shift on its axis. Major news networks picked up the story. framing it not as a corporate scandal but as a David and Goliath tale about genius being recognized despite systemic barriers. Parents of autistic children began sharing their own stories, creating a groundswell of support that reached into the highest levels of government. By the end of the week, 3 different universities had offered Sofia full professorships with visa sponsorship, and the National Science Foundation announced they were fast-tracking a research grant specifically for her communication platform development. The board meeting that was supposed to end with David's resignation instead concluded with a unanimous vote to transform Meridian Innovations into a nonprofit research foundation dedicated to assistive technology development. Marcus had done more than save his father's career or protect Sofia's future. He had sparked a national conversation about how society treats its most vulnerable and brilliant members, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions start with a single voice finally being heard. 1 year later, the scene that unfolded at the grand opening of the Marcus and Sofia Communication Center would have been impossible to imagine when this story began with a 12-year-old boy screaming on a conference room floor. The gleaming facility in downtown Phoenix represented more than just a triumph of technology and human compassion. It stood as living proof that sometimes the most profound changes in society begin with a single moment of courage, when someone chooses to see potential instead of limitation, genius instead of disability, and humanity instead of documentation status. David Chen stood at the back of the main auditorium, watching his son lead a coding workshop for 15 autistic teenagers, and marveled at how completely wrong he had been about everything that mattered. Marcus, now 13, and speaking with the confident clarity of someone who had found his voice in every sense of the word, moved between the computer stations with the natural authority of a born teacher. The metal braces that had once defined his physical limitations were gone, replaced by a sleek, adaptive device that enhanced rather than restricted his movement. But the real transformation wasn't physical. It was the way Marcus looked at each student, seeing their unique strengths instead of their challenges, speaking to them in the visual language that Sofia had taught him and that he was now passing forward like a precious gift. Remember, Marcus told a shy girl who was struggling with a particularly complex coding sequence, your brain doesn't work like everyone else's. And that's exactly why it's going to solve problems that everyone else can't even see. Sofia, now Dr. Sofia Morales Gutierrez, officially and permanently, served as the center's chief technology officer and director of research, her genius finally recognized by the institutions that had once rejected her without consideration. The communication platform she had developed in secret had been implemented in over 300 schools across America, helping thousands of nonverbal children find their voices and express their intelligence in ways that traditional education had never imagined possible. Her immigration case had become a landmark victory, setting precedents that would protect other brilliant minds from being discarded by a system that often confused documentation with worth. But perhaps her greatest achievement was watching Marcus teach other children that their differences weren't deficits to be overcome, but superpowers to be celebrated. The moment that captured the true magnitude of their transformation came during the center's dedication ceremony, when Marcus stepped to the podium to address an audience that included senators, tech executives, autism advocates, and hundreds of families whose lives have been changed by their work. A year ago, people looked at me and saw a broken boy who couldn't communicate, Marcus began, his voice steady and strong. They were wrong about the broken part, but they were right about the communication part. I couldn't communicate in their language. But when Sofia taught me that I didn't have to change my language to be heard, when my dad learned that love means listening instead of fixing, and when all of you decided that different kinds of genius deserve the same respect as traditional intelligence, everything changed. The standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 5 minutes, but it was the quiet moment afterward that truly mattered. David approached the podium where his son stood, and for the first time in their relationship, Marcus was the one offering comfort and wisdom to his father. You know what I learned, Dad? Marcus said, placing his hand on David's shoulder with the gentle confidence of someone who understood that strength comes in many forms. The most important code you can write isn't for computers. It's the code that teaches people how to see each other clearly. As David looked out at the center, filled with children who were discovering their own unique forms of brilliance, he realized that his son had just summarized the most valuable lesson of his life in a single sentence. The Marcus and Sofia Communication Center became a model that spread across the country, transforming how society understood autism, immigration, and the countless ways that human genius can manifest when given the right tools and recognition. Their story proved that true revolution doesn't require manifestos or movements. Sometimes it just requires the courage to dance when someone asks, the wisdom to listen when someone speaks differently, and the recognition that the most powerful changes begin when we stop trying to fix people and start learning from them instead. Here's what most people miss about this incredible transformation. David Chen's journey wasn't really about learning to communicate with his autistic son. It was about unlearning 20 years of believing that power means controlling outcomes instead of creating possibilities. As someone who's spent years studying these extraordinary stories of hidden genius and second chances, I can tell you that Marcus and Sophia's triumph reveals a truth that every parent, every employer, and every person who's ever felt underestimated needs to understand. The most dangerous assumption we make isn't about other people's limitations. It's about our own ability to recognize brilliance when it doesn't look like what we expected. Sophia's calculated revelation wasn't revenge. It was education delivered through experience, the only teaching method that actually changes hearts instead of just minds. She understood that David would never truly see his son's potential until he experienced the shock of discovering his own blindness. And Marcus? His courage to speak publicly wasn't just about defending his father or protecting Sophia. It was about claiming his rightful place in a world that had spent 12 years trying to make him smaller than his gifts. The real lesson here cuts deeper than autism awareness or immigration justice, though both matter enormously. It's about the staggering cost of our assumptions and the miraculous returns we get when we invest in people's strengths instead of trying to fix their differences. Every single day, in offices and schools and homes across America, there are Marcuses waiting to be seen, Sophia's waiting to be heard, and David's waiting to learn that their greatest achievement might be stepping back and letting someone else lead. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think about someone you might have underestimated or some part of yourself you've been hiding, then you understand why these stories matter. Hit that like button if you believe that genius comes in forms we don't always recognize. Drop a comment telling us about a time someone surprised you with their hidden talents. And subscribe to this channel because we're dedicated to sharing stories that prove the most extraordinary transformations happen when ordinary people find the courage to see each other clearly. Trust me, the next story we're sharing will show you how a homeless veteran's simple act of kindness exposed a corruption scandal that reached the highest levels of government, and why the powerful people who tried to silence him had no idea they were about to face the fight of their lives.